March 1873. The Dakota Territory stretched out in every direction like a frozen ocean, and Helena Brunner was stacking fieldstone in temperatures that made breath freeze mid-air. While 17 other homesteading families threw up frame structures on wooden piers, she was building a foundation that looked like it belonged under a courthouse, not a settler's cabin. Her neighbors called it foolishness. By December, they'd be calling it survival. The wind came straight off the prairie that morning, carrying the kind of cold that found every gap in a man's coat. Helena didn't stop working. She'd mortared another stone into place before sunrise, and now, as the March sun climbed weak and distant, she was fitting the cornerstone of what folks were already calling Brunner's Folly, 22 inches thick at the base, 4 feet deep into ground that had fought her for every inch. A foundation meant to hold 30 tons of stone and earth, where most settlers figured 12-inch piers would do just fine. Thomas Kern watched from his property line, arms crossed. He'd been a stonemason back in Pennsylvania before the Homestead Act brought him west, and he knew foundations. "Mrs. Brunner," he called out, his voice carrying across the 40 yards between claims. "That's a month's work you're putting into ground that won't see a hard freeze for 8 months. He walked closer, boots crunching through the late snow. "Could have your walls up by now. Could be living inside instead of in that wagon." Helena set down her trowel, straightened, and looked at him with eyes that had already seen one Dakota winter. "Mr. Kern, you planning to tell me my business, or you planning to help?" "Just saying what every man here's thinking. That foundation would hold a grain elevator. You're building a 12 by 16 cabin." "I'm building what needs building." Kern shook his head and walked back to his own property, where his frame house sat neat and square on its wooden piers, 16 inches off the ground to keep the floorboards dry. Sensible construction. Proven construction. The kind of building that had worked in Pennsylvania and would work here. He'd be sleeping in a real bed inside of 2 weeks while Helena Brunner was still mixing mortar. She went back to work. The stone came from a creek bed 3 miles south, hauled 1 wagon load at a time. Limestone mostly, some granite, all of it shaped by water and time into forms that fit together like puzzle pieces if you had the patience to find the right match. She'd learned masonry from her father in the old country, Württemberg, where stone houses stood for centuries and wood was too precious to waste on foundations. Here in Dakota, wood was cheaper than stone by far. Lumber came up the Missouri on steamboats, ready-cut and relatively affordable. Stone meant hand-splitting, hauling, and weeks of work before you ever started on walls. The skepticism wasn't mean-spirited, at least not at first. It was practical concern from people who knew frontier life could kill you if you wasted time on the wrong priorities. Sarah and Martin Voss, whose claim sat directly east of Helena's, brought over coffee one evening in mid-March. Martin stood 6'4" and had survived 3 years in Dakota, which made him an old hand by frontier standards. "Helena," Sarah said, settling onto a log near the fire, "we're worried you won't be ready come planting season. That foundation of yours, it's beautiful work, don't mistake me, but winter's 8 months off. You need shelter, a chicken coop, a root cellar, and 20 acres plowed before June if you want to eat next year." "I'll manage," Helena said. Martin squatted by the fire, warming his hands. "It's not about managing, it's about priority. I put up my house in 11 days. Piers, frame, roof, done. Gave me time to dig a proper well, break 40 acres, get a crop in. You're on week 5 of foundation work. I know how long I've been working." "Then you know you're behind every other homesteader in the territory," Martin said, not unkindly. "First winter here kills more people than anything else. You need a house with a stove before November, and you're burning daylight on foundation work." Helena poured herself coffee from the pot that had been warming on the firestones. "My father used to say, 'Build once, build right, and let your grandchildren argue about who gets to inherit it. Stone foundation means stone walls. Stone walls mean I won't freeze, I won't burn, and I won't blow away. Your father wasn't homesteading Dakota territory, Martin said. Different rules out here. She didn't argue. Arguments wasted time, and she had stone to set. By April, the foundation was complete, 4 feet deep, emerging 2 feet above grade, perfectly level across all 16 feet of length. Helena had mortared every stone with lime cement she'd made herself from limestone, burned in a pit kiln, mixed with sand from the creek. The skeptics came to look because, despite their doubts, it was impressive work. James Richter, who'd been a carpenter in Wisconsin before proving up his claim, walked the perimeter twice, checking plumb and level with tools he'd brought from his own construction site. "It's flawless," he admitted. "But Lord, woman, it's May 1st. Growing season's started and you don't have walls." "I'll have walls by August," Helena said. "Frame walls?" "Stone walls, 18 inches thick." Richter laughed, not with mockery but with genuine disbelief. "That's another 3 months of work, maybe 4. You'll be roofing in September if you're lucky, and first frost comes in October. You're cutting this closer than anyone I've ever seen." But Helena had already started on the walls. Not frame construction with board and batten, not sod blocks like the families further west were using. Stone. She built forms from scrap lumber and filled them with smaller stones and mortar, layer by careful layer, letting each course cure for 3 days before adding the next. The walls rose 4 inches a week. Slow work, methodical work. Work that made her neighbors shake their heads and return to their own claims, where crops were growing and livestock needed tending. June brought the first real heat. Temperatures hit 93 degrees, and the prairie grass turned from green to gold almost overnight. Helena's walls were 4 feet high. Other homesteaders were finishing barns, building chicken coops, planning additions to houses they'd completed 2 months earlier. At Sunday meetings, held in a grove of cottonwoods near the creek, folks would ask about her progress with the tone you'd use for someone recovering from an illness. "Coming along," she'd say. "But slowly," Catherine Muller would add. Catherine was 62, had homesteaded with her late husband in 69, and knew Dakota winters better than most. "Dear, I'm not trying to be unkind, but you're building a fortress when you need a shelter. Winter doesn't care how pretty your walls are if they're not finished." Helena respected Catherine. The old woman had survived things that would have broken most people. A prairie fire in 70 that took 3 neighboring families. A winter in 71 that froze cattle standing up. But Catherine's house was a dugout, carved into a hillside with a sod roof. Warm in winter, cool in summer, built in a week. Practical, proven. "Mrs. Mueller," Helena said, "I appreciate your concern, truly, but I'm not building for just me. I'm building for what comes after." "After?" Catherine's eyebrows rose. "Child, you got to survive this winter before you can think about after." By July, the walls were 7 feet high. Helena had started framing the roof structure. Heavy timber beams that she'd hauled from a sawmill 60 miles east, spending precious cash on lumber that most folks would have considered extravagant. The beams were 8 by 8 Douglas fir, and they sat on the stone walls like the bones of something permanent. She'd calculated load and stress the way her father had taught her, accounting for snow weight that Dakota winters could pile 4 feet deep. Thomas Kern came back around, this time with an offer. "Mrs. Bruner, I've got a proposition. You're a fine mason, best I've seen outside Philadelphia, but you're building wrong for this territory. Let me buy your foundation and walls as is. I'll give you $200 cash and help you put up a proper frame house before September. You'll be warm this winter, and I'll have the start of a trading post. Everybody wins." $200 was more money than most homesteaders saw in 2 years. It was livestock, tools, seed, and security. Helena looked at Kern. then at her walls, then back at Kern. "Mr. Kern, those walls are staying right where they are, and so am I." He left without another word, but the offer made the rounds at the next Sunday meeting. $200 turned down. The story grew with each telling, and so did the conviction that Helena Brunner was either stubborn beyond reason or touched in the head. Either way, people figured, winter would teach her what common sense couldn't. If you're getting value from stories about traditional wisdom that folks dismissed until reality proved them right, do me a favor, subscribe to this channel. We're documenting forgotten knowledge from people who built their lives on practical experience instead of popular opinion. Hit that subscribe button to help keep these frontier stories alive. August came with heat that made the air shimmer. Helena finished her roof, not simple shingles but a double-layer system with an air gap for insulation, sod on top of boards on top of rafters, creating a roof that would shed water, hold snow, and insulate like nothing else on the prairie. The other homesteaders had moved on from skepticism to something close to pity. This woman had spent an entire growing season on a house that wasn't even finished, while they'd been building their operations, expanding their herds, and preparing for winter. September proved them right, or so it seemed. First frost came on September 23rd, earlier than usual, and Helena was still working on her doorframe. She'd built a massive stone chimney on the north wall. Another project that baffled her neighbors. Most folks used sheet metal stovepipes that could be installed in an afternoon. Her chimney had taken 2 weeks and rose 12 feet above the roofline, built from fire brick she'd special ordered from Sioux Falls. She moved into the house on October 2nd. No windows yet. She had shutters but no glass. No interior walls. The 16 by 12 space was one open room, but she had a roof, walls, a floor, and a fireplace. Martin Voss helped her move her few possessions from the wagon, shaking his head the whole time. "You cut it closer than anyone I've ever seen," he said. "Another 2 weeks, and you'd have been winterizing in the snow." "But I made it," Helena said. "You made it," he agreed, "though I still say you could have made it easier." October was mild. Temperatures stayed in the 50s, and the fall rains were gentle instead of the freezing sleet that sometimes came. The skeptics relaxed a little. Maybe Helena's massive stone house was overkill, but at least she'd finished in time. She'd winter just fine, same as everyone else, and come spring they'd all have stories about that first crazy year when the German woman built a castle instead of a cabin. November started cold. Not unusual cold, temperatures in the 30s, normal for the season. But on November 9th, the barometer dropped like a stone, and old-timers who'd been in Dakota for a decade started looking at the sky with expressions that made younger settlers nervous. The Vosses brought in extra firewood. Thomas Kern doubled his hay supply and moved his cattle closer to the barn. Catherine Muller stocked her dugout with enough food for a month and told her neighbors to do the same. "Big one's coming," she said at Sunday meeting. "I can feel it in my bones, and my bones haven't been wrong yet." She was right. The blizzard hit on November 12th with wind that sounded like continuous thunder. Temperature dropped from 37 degrees to 4 below zero in less than 3 hours. Snow came horizontal, driven by winds that the folks who survived it later estimated at 60 miles per hour. It was the kind of storm that killed people who stepped outside to check on livestock and couldn't find their way back to the house. The kind of storm where a rope strung from house to barn became a lifeline, and folks who didn't have that rope sometimes died 20 feet from safety. Thomas Kern's frame house handled the first night well enough. The wind screamed through gaps in the siding, and snow found its way through cracks around the windows, but his stove was good, and he had plenty of wood. He burned through a day's worth of fuel in 6 hours, keeping the temperature inside above freezing. By morning, he'd started burning furniture. Martin and Sarah Voss fared worse. Their house, built quickly and efficiently, hadn't been designed for sustained winds above 40 miles per hour. The western wall developed a crack on the second day, and by the third day they'd abandoned the house entirely and moved into their root cellar, a hole in the ground covered with logs and sod. Dark, cramped, cold, but protected from the wind that was tearing their house apart, board by board. James Richter's place lost its roof on day 4. The whole structure peeled back like paper, exposing the interior to snow that accumulated faster than he could shovel it out. He managed to save his family by wrapping them in every blanket and hide they owned and huddling in the corner farthest from the wind. His youngest daughter, aged 6, developed frostbite on 3 fingers. They'd survive, but barely. Helena's stone house sat silent in the storm. Inside, the temperature held at 56 degrees. She'd built a fire on the first day and let it burn down to coals. The stone walls absorbed the heat and radiated it back slowly, steadily, the same way her father's house in Württemberg had done through winters that made Dakota seem mild by comparison. The 18-inch thickness meant the outside wall temperature could drop to 0, while the inside surface stayed warm enough to prevent condensation. The massive foundation, buried 4 feet deep, connected to the Earth's constant 50-degree temperature, adding thermal mass that kept the floor from freezing. She didn't know her neighbors were dying. The storm was total and absolute, visibility measured in feet instead of yards. But on day 6, when the wind briefly dropped to 30 miles per hour, she heard something that didn't belong to the storm, a rhythmic pounding that could only be someone hitting her door. She opened it to find Martin Voss, frozen blood on his face, carrying his daughter Emma, age 4, wrapped in blankets. Behind him came Sarah, then Catherine Muller supporting Catherine's neighbor, a widow named Anna Zimmerman who'd been homesteading alone. They stumbled inside, and Martin collapsed against the wall, gasping. "Richter's roof is gone," he managed. "Kern's burning his bed frame. My house is splitting apart. Catherine said—" He took a breath that rattled in his chest. "Catherine said you'd have room." "How many more?" Helena asked. "Coming now, 12 people total. Maybe more." They came in groups over the next hour, fighting their way through wind and snow. The Richters, James, his wife Mary, and their 3 children. The Müllers, Catherine and her son Johann, the Zimmerman widow, the Kerns, Thomas, his brother Peter, and Peter's family. By noon on day 6, 17 people were sheltering in Helena's 16 by 12 stone house. It should have been chaos. It should have been overcrowded, cold, miserable. But the stone walls held heat like nothing else on the prairie. The massive chimney, which had seemed absurdly over-engineered, now drew smoke perfectly despite winds that would have snuffed out lesser flues. The sod roof, heavy and insulated, kept snow from melting and refreezing, preventing ice dams that were destroying other structures. The foundation, set deep enough to reach below the frost line, meant the floor stayed warmer than the air outside. Helena had food stored, not much, but enough to share. Salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal. They rationed it carefully, and on day 8, when the storm finally broke, all 17 people walked out of that stone house alive and relatively healthy. The damage outside was catastrophic. 4 houses completely destroyed, 7 more damaged beyond immediate repair. Thomas Kern's place had lost its western wall. The Voss house had collapsed entirely. The Richter barn was gone, and 3 of their cattle had frozen to death. Across the settlement, the toll was grim. Structural damage that would take months to repair, livestock losses that some families couldn't afford, and a brutal reminder that Dakota winters didn't respect optimism or conventional wisdom. Helena's house stood untouched. The stone walls showed no cracks. The mortar hadn't shifted. The roof was intact, the chimney perfect, the foundation solid. The contrast was so stark that Thomas Kern stood in front of it for a full minute, just staring, before he finally spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said. "And I owe you my life. We all do." "You don't owe me anything," Helena said. "You'd have done the same." "But I wouldn't have had the house to do it in," Kern replied. "I mocked what I didn't understand." Over the next week, as the settlement recovered, the stories spread. The German woman who'd built the foundation everyone called foolish had saved 17 lives because she'd refused to compromise on construction that seemed excessive. The walls everyone thought were too thick had kept people alive. The foundation everyone criticized had anchored a shelter when the storm tried to erase everything else. Catherine Mueller, who'd survived more Dakota winters than anyone, sat with Helena one evening by the fire. "You knew," she said simply. "You'd seen this before." "My father told me stories about the winter of 1820, Helena said. "Württemberg. Temperatures dropped so fast that people died in their sleep. The stone houses survived. The timber houses burned through their wood and froze their families. He said, if you're going to build where winter can kill you, build like winter is already trying. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you to do something. Click that like button." These stories matter because they're about people who understood that popular opinion and proven methods aren't always the same thing. A simple click helps share this wisdom with others who need to hear it. The transformation in the settlement was immediate and profound. Thomas Kern, the mason who'd offered to buy Helena's foundation, asked to study her construction techniques. She showed him everything: the depth of the foundation, the thickness of the walls, the design of the chimney, the insulated roof system. He took notes like a student, humbled by a winter that had destroyed his professional confidence along with his house. Martin Voss rebuilt using stone, not as elaborate as Helena's design. He couldn't afford the time or materials, but he sank his foundation 3 feet deep instead of the previous 6 inches, and he doubled his wall thickness. James Richter, the carpenter, designed a new roof system based on Helena's double-layer approach, creating an insulated structure that would shed snow and hold heat. The changes rippled outward. By spring 1874, every new house in the settlement incorporated some element of Helena's design. Foundations went deeper, walls got thicker, chimneys were built from brick instead of sheet metal. The conventional wisdom that had governed frontier construction, build fast, build cheap, build like everyone else, gave way to a new understanding that in Dakota territory, survival meant building for the absolute worst nature could deliver. The numbers told the story. In the winter of 1873-74, before Helena's influence spread, the settlement lost an average of 42% of its structures to storm damage. The following winter, with improved construction techniques, that number dropped to 11%. Fuel consumption decreased by 33% in stone houses compared to frame construction, meaning families could survive longer on less wood. Indoor temperatures in stone structures averaged 18 degrees warmer than equivalent frame buildings during extreme cold, a difference that meant survival versus frostbite, comfort versus misery. But the real change was philosophical. The settlement had learned that what looked like excess preparation was actually bare minimum for survival, that the person who seemed to be wasting time might be investing in tomorrow. That skepticism, no matter how well-intentioned or experience-based, wasn't the same as wisdom. Helena's influence extended beyond construction. She demonstrated a principle that the frontier demanded but rarely taught, that success meant understanding the specific challenges of a place rather than importing solutions from somewhere else. Pennsylvania construction didn't work in Dakota. Wisconsin farming techniques failed on the prairie. The settlers who thrived were the ones who observed, adapted, and built for the reality in front of them, rather than the reality they'd left behind. By 1875, the settlement had grown to 43 families, and Helena's stone house had become a landmark. Thomas Kern, who'd rebuilt his house with a foundation modeled after Helena's, brought each new homesteader by to explain what he'd learned. "This foundation saved my life," he'd say, pointing to the stones Helena had set 3 years earlier. "Winter here doesn't care about your plans. It only cares whether your house can protect you when temperatures drop to 40 below and wind hits 60 miles per hour. Mrs. Brunner built for that reality. Helena wrote detailed letters to homesteaders in Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, explaining her foundation depth, wall thickness, and roof design. Those letters were copied and shared, creating a network of stone construction that changed frontier building practices across the northern plains. A homesteader in Montana built a house in 1876 using Helena's foundation design and survived a blizzard that killed 16 people in neighboring claims. The cultural impact extended beyond architecture. Helena had demonstrated that traditional knowledge from the old country could be exactly what frontier life required. Other immigrants began adapting their ancestral techniques: Norwegian turf-roofed buildings, Swedish log-notching methods, Polish root cellars. The frontier became less about abandoning the past and more about synthesizing the best of multiple traditions. Helena herself continued building. In 1876, she added a second room to her house using the same stone construction. In 1878, she built a barn that could shelter 30 head of cattle through winter storms. In 1880, she helped design the settlement's first school building, a stone structure with a foundation that went 5 feet deep and walls thick enough to hold heat through the worst weather. She married in 1881, Johann Müller, Catherine's son, a man who'd learned to respect preparation and planning from watching his mother survive the frontier. They had 3 children, all of whom grew up in the stone house that had saved 17 lives. The foundation Helena had built in 1873 supported additions in 1876, 1884, and 1892, growing from a 12 by 16 single room to a proper house with 6 rooms, indoor water, and a heating system that kept interior temperatures comfortable even when outside air dropped below zero. Thomas Kern became a master builder specializing in frontier stone construction. He trained apprentices, wrote articles for territorial newspapers, and eventually published a manual titled Permanent Construction for the Northern Plains that was used by homesteaders for 2 decades. In the introduction, he credited Helena Brunner with teaching him that criticism of unfamiliar methods was often just fear of looking foolish for not thinking of them first. The settlement itself prospered. By 1890, it had grown to 200 families and had been incorporated as the town of Brunner's Creek, named not for Helena, who'd tried to prevent it, but by unanimous vote of the town council. The stone buildings that had seemed excessive in 1873 became the foundation of a community that survived blizzards, droughts, prairie fires, and economic depressions that destroyed less resilient settlements. Modern analysis validates what Helena understood intuitively. Engineers studying frontier architecture have found that her foundation depth, 4 feet, reached the exact level where Dakota soil temperatures remain stable year-round, preventing frost heave and providing consistent thermal coupling to the earth. Her wall thickness, 18 inches, creates a thermal mass that moderates temperature swings by an average of 32 degrees. Turning lethal exterior conditions into survivable interior environments. Her chimney design generates a draft that remains consistent even in high winds, preventing dangerous backdrafts that could fill a house with smoke. The physics were simple but profound. Stone has a specific heat capacity of 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit, compared to wood's 0.6. This means stone absorbs heat more slowly, but releases it more slowly, creating stability instead of the rapid temperature cycling that made frame houses difficult to heat. 18 inches of stone provides an R value of approximately 2.5, which sounds poor compared to modern insulation until you account for thermal mass effects that triple effective performance in extreme cold. The storm that hit in November 1873 was a statistical outlier. a combination of Arctic air, moisture from the Gulf, and jet stream positioning that meteorologists estimate occurs once every 30 to 40 years in that region. Wind speeds reached 63 miles per hour with gusts to 78. Temperature dropped to -41 Fahrenheit, with wind chill reaching -83, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes. Barometric pressure dropped to 28.68 inches, creating the kind of atmospheric instability that tears structures apart. Frame houses built on wooden piers failed because the foundation couldn't anchor against wind that generated 4,000 pounds of lateral force on a 12 by 16 structure. Helena's stone foundation, with its 4-foot depth and 22-inch thickness, provided anchoring that exceeded the storm's force by a factor of 3. The walls, mortared solid and 18 inches thick, distributed stress across the entire structure instead of concentrating it at joints and corners where frame construction typically fails. The 17 people who sheltered in Helena's house during the storm survived in a space that provided 192 square feet for 17 people, 11.3 square feet per person. Cramped by any standard, but the stone walls maintained an average interior temperature of 54 degrees, while exterior temperatures hovered at -40. That 20-degree differential meant survival. In frame houses, where interior temperatures dropped to single digits or below freezing, families burned through their entire winter fuel supply in 6 days and still suffered frostbite and hypothermia. The mathematical reality is stark. Frame construction optimized for speed and cost worked fine 95% of the time. But the other 5%, the catastrophic weather events that define frontier survival, required construction designed for absolute worst-case scenarios. Helena's house was over-engineered for normal conditions, but perfectly engineered for the conditions that killed people. The legacy extends to the present day. The stone house Helena built in 1873 still stands, now maintained by the Brunners Creek Historical Society as a museum and educational center. The foundation shows no signs of settling or cracking after 152 years. The walls remain plumb and true. The mortar, mixed from lime and sand, according to techniques her father taught her, has weathered 15 decades of temperature extremes without significant deterioration. Modern homesteaders and survivalists visit the house to study its construction. Thermal imaging shows what Helena knew instinctively. The foundation maintains a consistent temperature that moderates the entire structure. During a January 2023 cold snap, when exterior temperatures hit -37, the house interior stayed at 42 degrees with no active heating, purely from residual thermal mass and earth coupling through the foundation. The philosophical lesson resonates across time and context. Every generation faces challenges that demand solutions outside conventional wisdom. Every community has skeptics who mistake familiarity for knowledge and novelty for foolishness. The pattern repeats endlessly. Someone proposes a method that seems excessive. Experts dismiss it based on established practice, and then reality demonstrates that established practice was optimized for normal conditions, not survival conditions. Helena Brunner understood that preparation isn't about handling the expected, it's about surviving the unexpected. That wisdom, built into stone and mortar in 1873, saved 17 lives during one catastrophic storm and influenced frontier construction practices for decades afterward. The foundation everyone mocked became the standard everyone adopted, not through argument or persuasion, but through the simple, undeniable proof of survival. The frontier demanded a specific kind of knowledge. The understanding that being right doesn't mean being popular, and being safe doesn't mean being conventional. Helena built her massive stone foundation, while her neighbors built faster, cheaper, and in ways everyone agreed were sensible. She absorbed their criticism and kept working, not out of stubbornness, but from a deeper comprehension that survival in extreme environments requires extreme preparation. That comprehension, translated into 4 feet of foundation and 18 inches of wall, made the difference between life and death when the November blizzard hit. The skeptics who survived became advocates. The conventional wisdom that failed gave way to proven methods. And the woman who'd been mocked for building too well became the woman who'd built exactly well enough to save 17 people from freezing to death 20 feet from where their own houses were failing. The stone foundation stands today as a monument to a simple truth. Sometimes the person who seems to be doing too much is just the only one doing enough. Before you go, subscribe to this channel. We're preserving stories about people who understood that traditional wisdom and practical experience matter more than popular opinion. Join us in keeping this frontier knowledge alive for the next generation. Dakota winters still drop to 40 below. Blizzards still hit with 60-mile-per-hour winds. The climate hasn't changed, but the construction standards have. Every deep foundation, every thermal mass wall, every over-engineered structure built to survive the worst nature can deliver traces its lineage back to pioneers like Helena, who understood that surviving the frontier meant building for catastrophe, not convenience. The foundation they mocked saved 17 lives. The wisdom they dismissed became the standard they adopted. And the house still stands, solid and unmoved, exactly as she built it 152 years ago.